Hello, I'm Veronique Mandel. Welcome to Scribes and Songsters. On the show today, we'll take a trek around the city of Windsor with Windsor's first poet laureate, and we'll talk sports with a local sports writer. We'll also hear some great guitar riffs from local musician Max Marshall. But now let's meet a good friend and former Windsor Star colleague of mine, Marty Gervais. In 2011, the city of Windsor appointed Marty Gervais as its first poet laureate, a position he continues to hold today. But Marty is not only recognized for excellence as a poet, he's also an award-winning journalist, photographer, playwright, historian, editor, teacher, and of course, an author. His work includes the best-selling book, The Rum Runners. Marty's also the founder and publisher of Windsor's Black Moss Press, which has published over 500 different titles. But today, we're going to talk to Marty about his most recent release, 5 Days, Walking 5 Towns. Marty, welcome to Scribes and Songsters.
Oh, nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you here. Now, how many books have you written?
Oh my gosh.
You're pretty prolific.
Yeah, I'm not really sure, actually. But nonfiction books, probably about 6, but I've written 10 or 12 poetry books. And a play and, lots of things.
Now, for people, if there is someone in the city of Windsor who doesn't know who you are, just in case, tell us a little bit about Marty Gervais.
Oh, well, a long time ago, the one thing I learned was when someone asks you what you do, you don't tell them where you work, you tell them what you actually do, and I'm a writer. And I've been saying that, and I've been doing that since I left high school. When I went to Toronto as a 17, 18-year-old boy, I went there with the idea of being a writer. And that's what I've been doing all my life. And as a writer, I've done all sorts of writing in the sense of writing poetry, writing nonfiction, but also spent most of my life working for a newspaper. And I worked at the Windsor Star for 30-some years and other newspapers before that. So I'm probably better recognized as a former columnist at the Windsor Star for writing the My Town column.
Right, very popular.
Yeah. But I've always had a deep interest in the city of Windsor. I think it's rich with history and it's rich with stories, and I love living there.
I think Windsor is a place people never think of in the words that you've just used. It's rich, and people from outside, I think, often don't appreciate what this city has and its historic context.
I agree. I would even take it further. I think a lot of people in our city don't appreciate it either. We have a very rich history, and there are a lot of firsts in Windsor that we should applaud ourselves for.
I absolutely agree. And in fact, we see so much of that in your book, 5 Days Walking 5 Towns.
Yeah.
Because as you go through these towns, you get such a sense of Windsor's history. I learned so much from your trek.
Oh, good. Thanks.
And it really was such a lot of fun to sort of take this trip with you.
Yeah.
So just sort of give folks, an overview of where you went, and then we'll talk about some of the highlights.
Sure. Well, what it was I decided to start the trip at the corner of Lausanne Road and Riverside Drive, and A-Bars was there. And, from the Rum Runners, you can read about A-Bars, and it was an old rum running haunt, and owned by Mrs. Hebert back in those days. And it was it was a place during Prohibition that brought people from Detroit, especially, some of the baseball teams. Babe Ruth was there. Marlene Dietrich, the movie star, was there.
I loved reading this stuff.
All of that, And so I started there, and I made my trek, for along Lausanne all the way to Wyandotte. And I decided to kind of visit the old neighborhoods because I grew up in Riverside. So going through Riverside via Wyandotte, and then making my way to Ford City, and then going up Drouillard Road and down Drouillard Road, and then cutting over to Walker Road, and then going through Walkerville, and then back again to Wyandotte Street and all the way to Willette Avenue, then going up and down Willette Avenue, and then over on University, and then going all the way to Sandwich Street and all the way to the end. So I started with A-bars, in Riverside. I ended at Chapel or Chappelle Street in Sandwich, where the old Lido or the Rum Runner Bar, or before that was called the Chapel House. So I began with a rum running place, and I ended with a rum running place. So
what distance was it?
I'm sorry?
Did you sort of clock the distance?
Yeah, it was about 17 kilometers altogether, because I did, little side trips here and there, but basically 17 kilometers. I didn't do it in 5 consecutive days. I started, it was like the worst time in some ways to start in December 29th, 2015. But you know what it was I didn't actually set out to write this book. My house was filled with grandchildren, and
you're escaping.
Yeah, and I just wanted to go somewhere peaceful, so I decided to just get out and walk and get some fresh air. But by the time I went through Riverside, I realized, I'm walking through history. I'm slowing down the landscape. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at houses that have an historic significance, and I with my iPhone I could call up the house the way it looked 70 years ago or 100 years ago.
That is so cool.
And then I'd see, well, maybe a veranda's gone, or the roof line is a little bit different. Someone's added an addition onto the house. And so, if you're walking, it slows everything down. If you're driving, you might catch a glance here, mm-hmm. a glance there. When you're walking, you're going by it slowly.
And everything's in focus.
And you take in so much more. Yeah. And you notice things that you never ever noticed before. So
tell me 5 things that you went, wow.
Okay. In Riverside, there's lots of, I grew up in Riverside. I was there till I was about 12. When I got to my old neighborhood, which is around Prado, it was just a rush of memories, things I had completely forgotten about. For example, when you're walking by Reedmere, I'm thinking of Dr. Henri Breau, who was one of the people who invented the child-proof prescription bottles, and now that was of some importance to me, not because in terms of history, but because I went to school with Rosemary Breau, his daughter. We were growing up together, and I called Rosemary and I was asking her about her father, and I said, your father was the one, of course, who invented this, and what was that like growing up in the house? And she said that he would bring home different models, test models, right? And he'd throw them on the kitchen table, and she and her sister would sit there and one by one open each one of them. And he knew that he was failing at this. But the other thing too is that the church, which is right on the corner of Riverside Drive and Drouillard, and and people will talk about the history of that church, and what I had forgotten about was that on that church was an illuminated cross, and I hear this now. I hear this occasionally in radio reports, etc. And they say, "Well, Al Capone put this illuminated cross on." He didn't. It was members of the church, and they put that cross up there because the rum runners were coming back from the Detroit area at night, sometimes driving these old jalopies across the ice, or coming back with their boats, and they needed somewhere, a focus point, and that would help them get across in the middle of the night. So, but it also, the other thing that was brought back to me was that my father, when he moved from Cobalt, he moved to Albert Road, and he was 26 years old. He was 16 years old when he arrived here, and to get a job working in the car plants. And so I was kind of reliving, his life in that area. And then going into Walkerville was just more of a rush of wonderful stories from there.
I know I said that I wanted to hear all 5.
Yeah.
But time flies.
Oh, I know. Sorry. Yeah.
Where can people find this wonderful book? But very quickly, did Bob Monks do any of these drawings?
No.
It's so Bob Monksian.
I know, they're very much like that. Owen Swain is the fellow who did these. Yeah.
Just wonderful.
They're gorgeous.
I know. It is so worth the read, Marty, because anyone who has any interest in the Windsor and all of the surrounding areas will love it.
Oh, thank you.
And so where can people get it?
Well, it's available in chapters. Actually, it's even at Costco.
Oh,
and,
excellent.
Biblioasis, of course, has copies, and I should be out and around, and I'd be happy to sign them, so no problem.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, if you want to learn things you'd never know about those 5 towns, Marty's book is a great read. Now, I love the guitar, and I play it badly, but our musical guest today plays it rather brilliantly. Max Marshall is from Harrow, Ontario, and is presently working on his 2nd album. Max makes his guitar sing with captivating finger-picking styles in his performances that range from soft introspection to frenzied bluesy interpretations. In 2017, he performed over 200 shows across Central and Eastern Canada and also toured the United Kingdom. In 2018, he's planning an album release, a cross-Canada tour, and also tours in Europe. Max Marshall was recently here in our studio and recorded some of his songs. We're pleased now to present one of his original songs, Well Wishers.
When I go up to Muskoka, there's a place where I go. In its woods where the trees make steeples, it's where I go to find what I'm looking for. That's where I go to find what I'm looking for. It's where I go to find what I'm looking for. How am I to know? 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 How am I to have known? In its lake, a lake trout awaits, got me baiting my fishing pole. And as you wait for dinner on your plate, lake will become a wishing well. Lake will become wishing well. Oh, the lake becomes a wishing well. Wish me some luck. It may never come my way, but how am I to know? 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 How am I to have known? We take our break on Bear Lake with our friends and family, and when we get together our voices tether, we get cleaned out by the harmonies. It's suddenly clear when you try to sing, you can't hide where your eyes have been. So I'll eat my food and spend my money until I'm hungry, until I'm broke. And although I got nothing to show, I'll build my house out of all 12 notes. I'll raise my family of all 12 notes, yes, I'll make my children's clothes. Out of all 12 notes, 'cause we live in a house built with all 12 notes. We live in a house built with all 12 notes, yes, I'll make my children's clothes. Out of all 12 notes.
Well, that was the wonderful guitar music of Max Marshall. Now let's talk sports. For many years, Bob Duff worked as a sports columnist at the Windsor Star, where he had the opportunity to cover some of the world's largest sporting events. Those include the Summer Olympic Games, the Super Bowl, the World Series, the World Cup of Soccer, the Stanley Cup Finals, and many more. Bob has also authored many sports-related books, including biographies of Gordie Howe, Steve Eisenman, Ted Lindsay, and recently, The 50 Greatest Red Wings. We're going to discuss Bob's latest book release. It's called The First Season, about the birth of the National Hockey League. Bob, welcome to Scribes and Songsters.
Oh, my pleasure to be here.
I'm just absolutely delighted, and I can't wait to get to the book. But sort of, how long have you been writing about sports your whole life? Is that
Well, not from the womb, but
Yeah.
since about professionally since 1983.
Wow? And did you always sort of think that sports is where your life was going to be?
Yeah, I mean, if I didn't end up playing it, I always knew that I wanted some role in it, and it just happened that I was a good writer, and I had a knack for sports and an acumen for sports, and I can remember when I was about 15, I was thinking about going into firefighting, and my mother said to me, "You don't want to do that because your mind's too active, and you couldn't sit around as much as they sit around, and you need a career where you're going to use your mind and be creative."
You had a smart mom.
Yeah.
So hockey has been in your blood.
Yeah, right from the get-go. And my mother, again, another story, she told me that if I was in my carriage or my crib and I couldn't see the hockey game on TV, I would start screaming until they moved it so I could see the game. So
Wow.
it was meant to be.
Yeah, no kidding. Now, were you a sports guy? Did you play hockey?
I still do.
Oh, wow. Well, speaking of hockey, let's get to your book. Now, I don't know if I should admit this, but I'm a huge Habs fan. And I have to be a Habs fan because my father, who was a great Newfoundlander, was a Habs fan, I think, when he came out of the womb. And so I've always been interested in hockey, but I usually don't read sports books. But your book, The First Season, is terrific. And I've learned so much, and I'm going to let you talk to us a little bit about it. The research in it is absolutely incredible. So how long did it take you to do this, and sort of just talk a bit about the process of doing this?
Well, having a lifetime in hockey and doing a lot of research and working on a lot of historical works, it gave me a good basis to start from. I kind of knew the direction I needed to go to get this done. If I didn't have that background, then it would have taken a lot longer. But I knew, the basics of the story of the launch of the NHL. It was just a matter of going to the sources and digging deeper and finding out, the minutia of it all and how it all came to be.
Yeah, I think people are going to be astounded by this, but tell us exactly how the NHL came to be.
Well, it'll be officially 100 years. The first game was December 19, 1917. Now, depends, when do you consider a league to start? The first meeting to form the league was on November 22nd, so yesterday technically was the birth of the NHL 100 years ago. But the genesis of it, there was a league that preceded it called the National Hockey Association. And through attrition because of World War I, because in those days, the athletes went and fought in the war. They didn't get any kind of dispensation or do any charity work or any kind of fundraising. They traded their stick in for a rifle and they went to the trenches. So many of the great hockey players of that era were over in Europe fighting. So there was very few hockey players left. Basically, they had married men and really young men who hadn't yet entered the service, but would soon. So there were very few players to choose from to put a league together. So that was a problem. They were down by the end of the 1916-17 season. There was only 4 teams left. They were so desperate for players, they actually put a team in that was all military players in basic training waiting to be shipped overseas, and unfortunately for the league, they were shipped overseas in the middle of the season, so they lost another team. And the Toronto team at the time was owned by a guy named Eddie Livingstone, and he was kind of part Harold Ballard, part George Steinbrenner, and part P.T. Barnum.
That's pretty scary.
He was a real character and a real agitator, and the other owners were just tired of his antics and his fighting. If they wanted to do X, he always wanted to do Y. It was just constant this all the time.
Yeah.
And they wanted to get rid of him, but he was stubborn and he wouldn't sell his team. He wouldn't leave. So how they got rid of him in 1916-17 was when the military team shipped overseas, they said, well, we can't have an odd number of team in the league, so we're just going to suspend the Toronto franchise for the rest of the season. So they got rid of him that way. And then they decided they kind of liked life without Eddie. It was a lot smoother. So they said
it was.
They had a meeting and decided, let's just form a new league and we'll leave Eddie out. Because there was nothing in the bylaws that said they couldn't do that. So they just met without Eddie and came out of the meeting and christened their new league the National Hockey League. And there was going to be 4 teams in it. They knew they were going to have the Montreal Canadiens, the Montreal Wanderers, and the Ottawa Senators. And the question was, would the 4th team be Toronto or Quebec? But if it was going to be Toronto, it would be Toronto owned by someone other than Eddie Livingstone. And as it turned out, that's what happened. And shady dealings that suddenly all of Eddie's players became property of this new Toronto team. So there was naturally many court battles fought over the years over that. Went on for almost a decade, the battles in the courtroom to try to sort this out.
Wow. It's a fascinating story. And I mean, I think everybody would, most people would think that, a team forms the way any team forms, but that background is really fascinating. Now, how they played the game, I think, is one of the best chapters in a book I've read. Tell us some of the really quirky things about how they played the game originally.
Well, you wouldn't have recognized the ice surface compared to today. Well, first of all, there's nothing painted on the boards other than white paint. And on the ice, there was only 2 lines between the goalposts for the goal lines, and there was a dot at center ice for the face-off at center. There was no other lines on the ice. You couldn't pass the puck forward. You could only pass it backward. So you basically had a game where it was about individual skill. And that's why if you look at the numbers, like Joe Malone was the leading scorer that year, had 44 goals and 4 assists. So you just didn't pass the puck because you took it and you beat the guy one-on-one. And the goalies, to start the season, the rule was they could not leave their feet to stop the puck. And if they did, it was supposed to be a 2-minute penalty. But the goalies got to where they made it look like an accident. They'd fall down and the ref would have to decide, did he do that on purpose? Did he slip? So finally, about 10 days into the season, after so many complaints from the referees, Frank Calder, the president of the NHL, said he'd had enough. He called a press conference and he said that the goalies could now fall down to stop the puck. Now, a reporter wanted to be clear on this. He said, so what you're saying is there's no more penalties if a goalie falls down to stop the puck. And Calder said, as far as I'm concerned, they may stand on their head to stop it if they think that will help them. And to this day, when a goalie plays outstanding, a coach will say he stood on his head.
Were there things that you found out? Their salaries, before I go to the other one. Talk about how much they made.
Well, not very much. Some of them didn't even make $1,000 for the whole year. And the top players would make, maybe $1,500, $2,000 at the most. And most of them had secondary jobs. Like Harry Mumry, who was a defenseman for Toronto, he drove a locomotive for CN Rail. So he couldn't get to play hockey till he finished out his contract with CN. So he'd have to work driving his locomotive till the end of the calendar year, and then he'd show up to play hockey. So there was incidents like that. Joe Malone, the guy I just mentioned, who was the leading scorer in the league, basically quit the second year. He got a job in a bank in Quebec City where he lived, and he said, it paid better than hockey, so why would I go to Montreal and give up a good steady job that I could have for, the rest of my life?
Yeah.
And so he would go to Montreal on the weekend, and if they were home, and play games. So he played maybe 8 or 9 games the second year.
Now, were there things in here that surprised you, things that you didn't know, that you found in your research?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the fact about the NHL only being a 1-year stopgap, I had no idea about that. I just thought they switched to the NHL, and that was the way they went from then on.
Yeah.
That was a real surprise to me. And I don't think there was honestly a whole lot else that I found out that I didn't know. There were a lot of stories I did know that I kind of expanded on and learned more about some of these guys. There was actually 2 Americans in the league the first season, which...
How did they get there?
Well, it had to do with the war. They were both munitions experts who were sent by their American company up to Canada once the U.S. entered the war in 1917 to help modernize the Canadian war plants.
Yeah.
And it turned out they were both from Boston and they were quite good amateur players. And the coach of the Montreal Wanderers, who was desperate for players because, as we said, there was so many of them off fighting in the war, found out these guys could play hockey and got them out to the team, and they ended up being the first Americans to play in the NHL. And the one guy actually, because in those days amateur hockey was very sketchy, and somehow he went back to Boston the next year and got reinstated as an amateur even though he'd played in the NHL. And in 1920, when they had the first Olympic hockey tournament, he played for the U.S. in that tournament, so he was the first NHL player to play in the Olympics.
Wow. Now, of all the athletes you've interviewed, and you've interviewed the biggest guys, is there one who stood out for you?
I think getting to know Johnny Bower was probably the best for me, because as a kid growing up in Toronto and a goaltender, you know, my heroes were Johnny Bower and Terry Sawchuk, who were the goalies for the Leafs when I was a kid. And to get to not just to meet Johnny, but then to get to do his biography, write his life story, and get to know him and his wife Nancy and his whole family, and embrace me almost as part of their family, and stay in touch to this day. And just everything you think about Johnny Bower being this wonderful man is so true, and then some. Like, I've just never met anyone like him. He's just one of a kind. I call him the honorary grandfather of all Maple Leaf fans.
That's fantastic. I wish we had more time, but congratulations on your book. It really is a tremendous read. Now, where can people buy it?
Well, Biblioasis has it in the store and also on their website. You can get it on all the bookstores you'd get any books, and certainly Amazon, you know, all the online places you'd look have it as well.
That's wonderful. Good luck with it.
Thank you.
Well, regrettably, that's it for another edition of Scribes and Songsters. Thanks to Gary and Brian, as always, for your great work. And thank you for joining me. I hope you'll come back soon. I'm Veronique Mandel. Bye for now.
Although I got nothing to show, I'll build my house out of all 12 notes. I'll raise my family off of all 12 notes. Yes, I'll make my children's clothes out of all 12 notes, 'cause we live in a house built with all 12 notes. We live in a house built with all 12 notes. Yes, I'll make my children's clothes out of all 12